Okay, good evening. My name is Amara, currently an adult services librarian for Trumbull Library System. This evening's program is part of the Dinner Disrupted series, a multi-library initiative focused on land use, agriculture, climate change, and food security. The intention of the series is to generate conversations and opportunities for residents of Fairfield and New Haven counties to learn, discuss, and participate in the food system. Why? Your public library is always looking ahead to prepare for the changing needs of the community it serves. Libraries provide public spaces for conversations and the testing of ideas. Libraries create opportunities to learn about local activism and changes in the community, and libraries showcase how regional initiatives help shape and create communities. The more we understand about the local food system and its importance, the better we can prepare as communities and regions for the future effects of climate change, economic disruptions, and global pandemics. Please look for the Dinner Disrupted series on your library's calendar or visit dinnerdisrupted.com to learn more about and join the conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jen from Westport Library to introduce tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Amara. I'm Jennifer Keller of the Westport Library, and I am here and so excited to introduce co-authors Drew Pendergrass and Troy Vettesse, and our moderator, Kevin Gallagher. Drew is currently a PhD student in environmental engineering at Harvard University. His current research uses satellite, aircraft, and surface observations of the environment to correct supercomputer models of the atmosphere. His environmental writing has been published in Harper's, The Guardian, Jacobin, and Current Affairs. Troy Vettesse is an environmental historian and a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute. He studies the history of environmental economics, energy, and animal life under capitalism. Troy's writing has appeared in publications such as Book Forum, New Left Review, and The Guardian. And finally, Kevin Gallagher is a documentary producer and videographer for independent productions. He has held many positions at PKN, including hosting Digging in the Dirt, a radio program where Kevin and his guests dig a little deeper into issues surrounding climate change, the environment, farming, gardening, and food. And without further ado, gentlemen, I will let you have the stage and tell us more about Half-Earth Socialism.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer and Amara. As they said, I'm Kevin Gallagher from Digging in the Dirt in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and I'm happy to be here today. Congratulations, Drew and Troy, on the publishing of your work. It's an impressive deep dive into the history of how we got to this moment and what possibly faces humanity. Why don't we get started by laying out the problems as you see it in the book, and then we'll get into the plan that your book proposes.
Well, the book is, first of all, thanks so much for the invitation. We're really happy to be here. And it's kind of amazing to hear how well I think the book fits into the broader program. So this is really exciting for us. The book basically has two goals, which is to understand why there's an environmental crisis. And why is the environmental crisis so bad? And then what would a society that overcomes the environmental crisis look like? That's basically it.
And so the subtitle of the book is A Plan to Save the Future from Extinction, Climate Change, and Pandemics. So that's pretty sobering kind of announcements. You know, you've done your research extensively. The book is quite extensive and a real valuable resource, I think, for people interested in this subject. But what is it that you're going to propose now? What you have, it's called Half-Earth Socialism, which is sort of a new term.
Yeah, so I guess we'll start by breaking down the title. So half-Earth, right, is a concept that originates kind of in some environmental movements and was popularized by E.O. Wilson, the famous and biologist turned general environmental writer. The idea, based on Wilson's work on island biogeography, is the field way back in 50 years ago or so, was that the biodiversity of an island or a region has a relationship with the amount of land in that area. It goes with the fourth root, roughly, of the land area. So if you have more land, you have more biodiversity, you can support more biodiversity. And we're living in the middle of the 6th mass extinction in Earth's history. which some viewers may have heard about. So 5 previous in the Earth's 4.5 billion year history. There have been 5 previous mass extinctions. We're in the middle of the 6th that's driven by human activity, and principally driven by habitat loss from human activity. So humans converting ecosystems into often rangeland for cattle or cropland for animal agriculture, and then other uses as well. And so the idea of the half-Earth is that if you keep some of this land set aside for ecosystem functioning, then you can avert the worst of the 6th mass extinction. So that's where the half-Earth idea comes from. And that kind of leads into one of the broader arguments of the book, is that land use is a major constraint in how we think about the environment and the environmental crisis. Renewable energy systems require much more land than fossil fuel-based energy systems, right? Fossil fuels are concentrated sunlight, right, from the past, right? You have a bunch of plants millions of years ago taking up the sunlight, dying, getting compressed into concentrated energy that we can burn. Whereas if we're taking energy more directly from biofuels or through solar or wind, it requires more land. You're getting a flow of energy. So that those goals start to compete with the goals of the food system. The food system requires huge amounts of land, mostly for animal agriculture. Animal agriculture takes up a very significant part of the Earth's surface. So we start kind of running into some problems when we think about energy transition, mass extinction, and the food system. There's not enough land for all of our goals. So at this point, I'm going on a little bit.
That's okay.
So maybe I'll pass it to Troy to talk about other aspects of the plan.
Well, I'll just say one thing. I mean, Drew hinted at that the problem that we're facing can be understood really in 2 aspects. One would be the problem of stock, which would be like fossil fuels, like things that have accumulated over long periods of time, but do not actually take up much space. Relatively speaking, but they mess up with geological time, as in we are bringing up carbon that has taken millions of years to become deposited, and then we are burning that very quickly, and so the carbon cycle is out of sync. And then the other problem is a problem of flows, and that has to do with the amount of solar energy that is hitting the Earth all the time. And in a renewable energy based society, one would rely on flows and not on stocks. And to deal with flows leads into a problem of space, right? Because there's only so much space of the Earth where we are getting solar energy. So we have to decide how we are using that space. So that tension between time and space is an important part of the book. And then I will also say that, as you hinted with the subtitle, what we're trying to do in the book is to talk about the environmental crisis as a whole, and say that zoonotic disease, the transition to renewable energy, the climate crisis, extinction, all these things are related to each other. And we need a lens that lets us talk about all these things at once. And we think most environmental books have just focused on one problem at a time. And we think that's a mistake. And then the last thing I'll say is, the book is focusing on the half-Earth problem, which again is emphasizing that we should care about biodiversity and extinction. And then we should also imagine and think about problems of land. And that the conservation movement, as we have it today, will fail because it is not radical enough. So that's why the conservation movement has to be socialist, because it has to understand why these problems are caused in a capitalist society and they cannot be solved in a capitalist society.
Well, that's my next question is, why not half-Earth capitalism? Can't we remedy this with a little bit of both? So I know you have an answer for that one.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So that's the other half of the title. So one of the points that we try and establish in the book's kind of first half is that the scale of the problem and the difficulty of solving it. So there's, broadly speaking, there's this literature in science called planetary boundaries, and the idea is that there are some amount of human influence in nature that kind of gets to a destabilizing point. So climate change is a very commonly cited issue here, where if we have too much carbon emitted from the lithosphere, to the atmosphere, from the earth buried down to the atmosphere. We get a bunch of heating, and this will lead to increasing instability in the climate system, increasing impacts on humanity for every, little bit of warming we have. And then there are also impacts from the food system. There's eutrophication, right, where runoff from fertilizer causes algae blooms. There's biodiversity loss. There's human health impacts from pollution. There's all sorts of boundaries out there that one can talk about. And there's literature is kind of quantifying the impacts of exceeding various amounts of these human impacts in the environment. Meanwhile, we also want to make sure that everyone has enough resources to have a good life, right? We need to make sure people have enough food and energy, et cetera. So there's this balance between, enough resource for people's health and well-being, and then not too much resources for the planet's well-being. And so navigating that space is very challenging, and it's especially challenging for a market-based society. So we live in a market-based society where major productive decisions, like what to build, where to build it, what kind of infrastructure to build, is made not by human conscious decisions, not by us sitting down together and being like, we want to do X or Y, but rather by market forces, kind of individual capitalists responding to the economy as a whole and using that to make their decisions. And this, for navigating this small space between too much and not enough, this small, narrow space of planetary flourishing, that's not going to cut it. That's the challenge is massive. If you think about it, we're talking about leaving trillions of dollars of assets in the ground. You cannot burn any more fossil fuels, or you can't build any more fossil fuel infrastructure with the IPCC 1.5 degrees Celsius warming plan. You are highly limited. That's leaving so much money in the ground. And then you have to build up this entirely new system. That's a huge challenge, and we just don't think that this existing system is up for it. And Troy, I'm sure, can fill in all the gaps here.
Yeah, I see it as like, I guess there's two issues here. There's the environmental issue, and then there's the economic issue, and they both meet. And with finite resources of the planet, you just can't keep exploiting the way it's being exploited under the present system.
Well, I mean, I would say that they're not separate issues, right? I mean, the economic and environmental, like basically what capitalism is it's a system where where basically you're creating a second nature, right? And the second nature is the world that is humanized in terms of commodities and machinery and things we can buy and sell on the market. And capitalism is always trying to expand that sphere, and it comes at the cost of things that had been natural before, right? As in had been things were existing for the sake of an organism or an ecosystem and so forth. And one can imagine also our relationship between us and nature has changed between capitalist societies and pre-capitalist societies. You think about the fur trade or something like that. You have indigenous people, they're hunting, they're using fur, they're eating meat or whatever it is. But in that society, it doesn't make sense to hunt down like the last beaver or whatever it is, right? Because you will have no more beaver. And also it would take a lot of effort to find that last beaver, right? And you only need to work as much as you need to sustain yourself. And in a capitalist society, it's not about the use value of an object, but the exchange value, as in whether you can secure a profit on it. And therefore, what happens is you have to get people to hunt more beaver. You have to convince them and force them into market relations in different ways, make them dependent upon the market to survive, to make them work. And a big thing that happened, of course, was the use of alcohol, for instance, to get people to be addicted to actually work. And then you will hunt until the very end, because as long as it makes more money for that last species, rather than caring about the reproductive rate of that species, because you always can invest your money elsewhere. So you will then hunt things to extinction, and then you will try to find a solution where maybe you'll try to farm, nutria or something like that, which is a beaver-like animal which you can raise in fur farms. But my point is, like, you need to have this constantly expanding sphere, because otherwise you enter into a crisis. So I think, and what capitalism basically is a decentralized economic system where you have capitalists competing against each other. And how do they compete? They have to raise the productivity of workers. Raising the productivity of a worker means they're able to basically harness more natural resources per hour worked. And you do that often by increasing available energy to them, or increasing the stock of natural resources that they're using. And this is always going to be increasing this capitalist sphere. So this is why we have incredible productivity gains, but that comes at a cost of the environment. So again, I want to stress that these problems are closely related to each other. And then the other thing, to really understand why we live in such a bizarre society, and as Drew was saying, these are not human decisions at some level where we invest, but rather what is most profitable. Is we can be well aware that we are screwed in lots of ways, where we can think, if we keep on burning fossil fuels, we'll have like 3 or 4 degrees of warming, and this will be disastrous. But yet we're unable to stop, right? So as long as those market conditions continue to exist, then we will be in trouble. And then efforts to restrain markets is difficult in a world market, because some capitalists will have access to making profit in this way, and some won't. So we need to have a global coordinated solution. And then the last thing I'll say is that, I think the tragic nature of capitalism is that when you hear people talk about the energy transition, they have to say, okay, we need so many gigawatts of solar panels and wind turbines installed, and it has to be profitable, right? So we have like this, this use value, which is we need to have useful things and build them, but they also have to be profitable, and as profitable as these things that are destroying the world at the same time. So trying to achieve both those goals at the same time is probably not going to happen, right? And that's why we need to do unprofitable things, basically.
And just to add on here, solar panels are now one of the cheapest forms of energy. And so if you look at new energy capacity being added to the US, a lot of it's in renewables like energy and wind. The problem is that all the old energy capacity is still there, right? Like all the old fossil fuel plants. So it's not even enough that solar panels are now cheaper than fossil fuel infrastructure. You have to take down the stuff that you've already built, right, for the energy transition. You've already invested huge amounts of money into your natural gas system, into your petroleum system, into all these systems. And you have to just consciously shut that down and lose all of your money, right? So it's not even enough to be cheap. Like, it's not even enough to be profitable. You have to consciously make unprofitable decisions, which the institutions that own this infrastructure are not actually able to do. They cannot make unprofitable decisions.
I've seen some people suggest that we pay them to keep it in the ground.
I mean, I think this is, I guess, some kind of Pigouvian solution, as in you're trying to internalize the externality by, paying people to act in a beneficial way. But I think just the scale of it is hard to imagine. And as Drew's saying, just the loss of profit is pretty hard. I think, if we look at what's happening right now, given the situation in Ukraine, I mean, suddenly, we have this push to actually build more fossil fuel infrastructure. And that's because
frack
the
more.
Is high. Yeah, sorry?
Frack more and things like that are already being suggested.
Yeah, because it's extreme, as in like renewables are cheap, but they're not that profitable, right? If anything, they cause a lot of problems for utilities, because if you build a lot of renewable energy and it's very sunny, suddenly the price of energy drops to zero, and then and they're flooded with this kind of, super cheap energy, and then everything else is also going to be losing money. So actually, there's been a push where a lot of utilities want to prevent renewables from being built because it causes problems for the rest of their infrastructure.
So how do we do this?
Yeah, I mean, so we are proposing, as a society, we need to collectively decide what goals do we want to achieve, right? We have to think about it. How much carbon do we want to emit? What is the degree of warming, or how many degrees of warming we're content with? How many extinctions we're willing to cause? What are the living standards we want for people? Do we want to equalize living standards between people within a country, but also between countries? And these are the decisions we have to make. And these are all, and what's interesting about these decisions is that they are not commensurate with one another, right? As in extinctions, you don't have like 3 extinctions for one, 1,000 watts of energy production. And you can't really exchange these things, but they are still related to each other. So we have to look at the relationship between these environmental and energy and agricultural decisions that we're making, and figure out what we're happy with. Because again, right now we're blind. As we're going forward blindly, we have no idea like how we live is sustainable or not. We don't know if we're doing better or doing worse. We don't know what the future looks like. And we just act as individual consumers and business owners, and that's not helpful.
Right. What we're kind of thinking about is expanding democracy, like democracy's long journey from, a few, landholders, right, in the US, few white people, to like universal suffrage over the political sphere. And now we're talking about, kind of democratic control over the economy, which is a part of society where we don't have democratic control. Your work is kind of a little mini dictatorship where you have to follow all the rules, right? But you don't have a say. So the trade union movement's trying to, make that democratic. But what we're imagining is, with these questions, these very hard questions of trade-offs, of like, how much should our living standards be? Like, how much energy should we be using? What kind of energy should that be? Will we be willing to tolerate brownouts or blackouts? Or will we need to build some new nuclear power plants as backstops? Are we willing to accept that? And it's kind of seeing everything in one view, right? Like, what food system do we want? How much meat do we want? Meat takes up a lot of land, has a lot of environmental consequences. And what we want is to kind of allow people to kind of see some views of the future, right? Like, we imagine these blueprints of the future being offered as a with some input from the community. Like, we create blueprints for the future, and then we vote on which future we want to follow. Do we want a kind of a climate scenario where we continue our high living standards in the US and maybe globalize them, and then accept the massive environmental consequences, like maybe use solar geoengineering, where we fly planes to spray sulfur into the stratosphere to cool the climate? That would probably be necessary if we chose that kind of fossil-driven development pathway.
You don't see good things for the future if we continue on the path that we're on.
Well, the thing is that if it was democratically decided on, it at least would have some legitimacy, and there would be some conscious awareness of the trade-offs. We don't even have that. We don't even have like the benefits of like using, fossil fuels to make the world richer. Like, that's not on the table right now. So like that it's just a lot of, people consuming a lot of energy and everyone else consuming very little. So
you have some major things that you think we could do, and one of them would be to pursue, half-Earth. We preserve a lot of the earth so that it can resuscitate itself and thrive. The other thing is that you want to pursue a rapid transition to renewable energy, which seems to be a doable thing and seems to be more on the table, although wars like the Ukraine, as you mentioned, have sort of put a damper on that a bit. And then one of the things you just mentioned, which I really want to talk about, is veganism, or being a vegetarian. The world eating a lot of meat is a real big problem. Maybe we can discuss that, because I think that is something in the book that I think a lot of people can put themselves in the position of understanding what meat does to the world.
That's a lot to answer. Let's try to get this straight. I mean, basically, just to clarify in terms of what Drew's talking about in terms of these decisions, it would be using certain planning tools to see these trade-offs. And what Drew used in the book is something called linear programming, and he can very quickly work out a model where you can see, okay, what is energy production, like how many watts are people getting, how are you producing that energy, and how much land does this use up, because biofuels use up a lot more land than fossil fuels, and solar and nuclear are in between that. And then, how much meat are people getting? How much land do we need for that? And what are our goals in terms of conservation, right? Do we want half the earth? Do we want a third? Do we want 2/3? And then we can also try to estimate how much carbon we want to emit. And we can, this model is one way of saying, okay, this is a kind of society that's fair for everyone, and we can debate where we set those limits, right? So, I mean, someone can say, I'm fine with more extinction if I get more meat or whatever it is. But we should have those conversations. This is the democratic aspect that Drew's hinting at, is saying that, we have to decide collectively on these things because it affects everyone, right? These things, we're always affecting people. People are not like neutral actors on a market where their actions don't affect anyone else. I mean, that's just a fiction. So we have to decide how we want to carry things out, because otherwise we're just going to end up in a world that's going to be a total environmental disaster and with incredible inequality, and that's not great. And in terms of the meat problem, so as you're saying, meat is important in a few ways, right? Obviously, it's a huge ethical issue, which is the most common argument, but also it matters in terms of zoonotic disease, which is not really discussed that much at all, even though we're living during a pandemic. And what you have to realize is that livestock can both give us disease, right? Because we are so close to all these animals. And humans did not have disease before animal domestication. I mean, we had like parasites or things like that, but we did not have diseases like influenza or smallpox or the list goes on, right? Before 10,000 years ago when we started domesticating animals. And therefore, that's like another trade-off we have to talk about, like how much of a risk of disease are we willing to live with if we also want to eat meat, right? And then we can keep going on about meat, where the amount of land you need for an omnivore is about 1 hectare a person, which is like, I think, 2.5 acres or something like that. And a vegan would be around 1/10 of that. They need relatively little land because you're eating the plants directly rather than feeding them to an animal. And a vegetarian is about half that, right? In between vegans and omnivores. So these are all things we have to decide, as in, like, what is the risk of disease we're comfortable with? As in, like, avian flu can happen. It's going to be a lot worse than COVID. And how much land are we going to use up? Because right now it's a huge amount of land that's dedicated towards animal agriculture.
So with the pandemic, I'm sorry, Drew, I just want to be clear about this COVID stuff. You think that because of the way that we treat animals, the way we were treating our environment, that we're producing these kind of pandemics that we're getting now, and they could actually be even worse?
Yes, it could be much, much worse. I mean, a lot of diseases that have emerged recently over the last 50 years or so have much higher mortality rates than COVID. And COVID is around 1% or 0.5%. And the previous SARS virus, which emerged in 2002, had a mortality rate around 18%. And then other diseases like Hendra or Menangle, which came out in Australia in the 90s, had mortality rates of close to 50%. So, and we were really afraid of avian flu. Avian flu is what people are really worried about because it's extremely dangerous, has a very high mortality rate, close to half, I believe. And it keeps emerging where there will be animal to human transmission of the virus. And this happens all the time. I mean, if you look out in the news, you'll see people mentioning, oh, this has happened. The dangerous thing is when you have human to human transmission, right? When the virus evolves in that way. And that has happened once already. right? So it can happen. And
When did that happen?
that happened in '97. That was the first time, because avian flu is an older virus. I mean, it's been around for a while, but the first human-to-human transmission was, I believe, in '97. And that really scared people because once you have a virus like that that is transmissible, or with, that humans can get and will spread, it could cause, millions and millions of deaths, right? And people are expecting it to happen. And these are also, there's like the known dangers, right? Where people are tracking certain diseases. And then there are diseases that we have no idea that could emerge, right? I mean, we don't even know where COVID came from, right? We don't know the original animal. It probably was a mix of animals at, what they call it, these exotic animal markets.
Marketplace, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it probably was a mix. And what happens is, this is not the first time this has happened, where you take animals that will never see each other in nature, right? And put them close together in unsanitary conditions, and they will transfer viruses amongst themselves. And I believe the Marburg virus, it was like a mix between, it was a monkey and, I'm mixing it up. But I mean, like, what happens a lot is you have exotic animals that are stored in airports, right? Because people, they're confiscated, or people are transporting them. And you'll have, a monkey next to, I don't know, like a ferret or something, and then you might get a new disease that way. Because these animals will not interact in nature, but we have created conditions where they can interact. And what happened in China, basically, is that you have the demise of traditional agriculture, right? And then so we have a lot of more factory farms, which is a big reason why we've seen an explosion of new diseases over the last 50 years. And then these former peasant farmers, to make a living, they've been encouraged to engage in exotic animal farming. And that is just extremely dangerous. So we have the risk of diseases coming from livestock, right? Then we have the risk of diseases coming or emerging because we are deforesting areas to create land to feed that livestock, right? And then we have this exotic animal trade. And these are connected problems, and they're all really terrifying.
So one of the other things that you are suggesting in the book too, just from the title and what you lay out, is that we have to switch from capitalism to socialism. And here in the capitalist nation of the world, that's a tough order when you have the government is subsidizing, industry, and they're not too much interested in socialism. How do we proceed?
Well, I think we saw in the US that there's a lot of interest in big change, right? Like with the Bernie Sanders campaigns, right? In 2016, 2020, there was, especially among young people, a lot of interest in radical change. But you're right that this is a tall order. One of the ways that we talked about this, we framed this book, is that it's a utopian book. So we have opening quotes about utopias. They have an Oscar Wilde quote about progress being the realization of utopias, of like people coming up with utopias and working to achieve them. So what we thought is that we first need to have a dream of a future that would be livable, that would overcome the crisis in all of its facets, biodiversity, like have something out there, and then an idea of how we might debate over what futures we might want, and have that vision out there to kind of be, a dream to work towards. And we use a metaphor with another movement that we are opposed to that also used this sort of utopian frame to advance its goals. So the neoliberal movement, which is kind of originates in the 40s, right? Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises and all these thinkers, they are kind of thinking in an era when kind of planning was reigning supreme. Capitalism looked like it was on its way out. There was the Great Depression. There was World War II, when countries are planning their efforts. You have the rise of social democracies after that, right? Like, Britain's healthcare system kind of comes out in that aftermath. So capitalism looks like it's on the back foot. And then these utopian neoliberals, they want to imagine capitalism from the ground up, liberalism from the ground up, right? A new way of thinking about markets and liberalism. And they're total outsiders. They're kind of completely out of the mainstream, but they have this utopian vision, And then, 30 years later, they get the opportunity, right, with stagflation and the oil crisis in the US, and then a few other things to push this deregulation agenda, this market agenda, this privatization agenda. And they've created the world that we now live in. So don't underestimate the power of a good utopia. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would say, we're not necessarily confident that our book is going to change the world. We wouldn't be so hubristic as that. But we think it is important for any movement to understand the world that it lives in, that it exists in, and then to also have a long-term vision of what it wants to do, what it wants to create. And I think you cannot act unless you know those two things. And as Drew's saying, the neoliberals figured that out for themselves, as in they could diagnose what was wrong with the world, and then they could create solutions, which would be, more markets, and that gave them this capacity to propose solutions and to diagnose problems that proved very effective, especially during crises, right? So as you have crises in the 1970s where this totally dominant welfare state, Keynesian orthodoxy, it fails, right? As in it cannot explain certain problems, and its model is not working anymore. Then the neoliberals stepped in and they said, here's what's wrong and here's what you need to do. And that's extremely important. And the problem with environmentalists and social democrats and socialists is that they don't have either capacity. They don't understand the cause of problems, or we would say that their understanding is flawed, especially for the environmental movement that's very Malthusian, that blames too many poor people being born for the problems that we're in, which is a dangerous idea and also not a useful idea. And then you also need to know how to act, as in what do you actually want to create? And we think this is the problem with, again, an environmentalist movement that thinks capitalism is fine, and capitalism is can be part of the solution, and you don't need to actually have any conflicts. We have win-win solutions, and that has just completely failed.
Right.
And then you also have socialists who don't know can't tell you what socialism is, which is not a great thing. And then, or they want to totally dominate nature, and this Promethean strain in the left is still very strong. So our book is trying to deal with those two problems.
Yeah, you're pretty tough on environmentalists because they seem to, from what I've read, they're pursuing win-wins for business and the environment, and you're not too sure that's going to work out.
Well, just think about what I said a second ago about taking all this fossil fuel infrastructure offline or leaving things in the ground. That's trillions of dollars right there, right? Like you can win-win in terms of building new solar panels, but you can't win-win in terms of transitioning off of the things you've already built.
Well, I would also say that, okay, they built some new solar panels, but the actual share of fossil fuels in the total energy mix has remained around 80% or 85% for decades. It has not moved, right? So we are building more renewable infrastructure, but as long as the whole pie is growing, then it doesn't matter, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where, as Drew's saying, we need absolute reductions, and that's going to come at a hefty price. And in my day job as a historian, because this book isn't really a historical work, it's really more my manifesto of some sort. I study neoliberal environmental thought, and I study things like cap and trade and all that. And cap and trade has not worked. It would be the idea that we can create a market for the right to pollute and that will lead to certain efficiencies is mistaken and leads to certain problems. I mean, first of all, you can concentrate certain harms in an area. For example, they wanted to create a cap and trade program in mercury, and having to have hotspots of mercury pollution because it is market efficient is very dangerous for the people living nearby. And then the problem is that the neoliberals don't want cap and trade to really constrain production. They don't want to have a really high market price. If you had carbon and it was priced at $1,000 a ton, maybe you would see some reductions. And instead, most carbon markets are below $100 or less. I mean, the European market for the longest time was only about €3 a ton. And at that point, like, who cares, right? So I think you have this like illusion of movement or an illusion of progress in the environmental movement over the last 30 years, but things have gotten much worse since 1990 in almost every respect.
Is this the same reason you're also negative about geoengineering? That this is like a capital way of trying to get out of our problem that sometimes creates even bigger problems.
Right. Yeah. So we set up this framing in the book that we'll ultimately come to a decision, right, where we either plan the economy, right, what we were talking about democracy, expanding democracy to the economy, or plan nature and let the economy go on as it's going. And by plan nature, we mean geoengineering, right? So capital kind of blindly is forcing individuals to make profitable decisions, and that's leading to the ruin of the planet. So if you want to continue with capitalism, then you have to make the planet suitable for capitalism to continue to function, for markets to continue working. So you need a certain temperature regime. And so one way you can try and do that is fly those planes up to the stratosphere, spray some sulfur out the back, and then dim the sun, right? Like reduce the amount of solar radiation coming in. It's a quick fix. It's cheap. It'll only cost a few $1 billion. We talk in the book about the side effects of this, which are unknown until we do it, but they could be enormous. We could talk about things like the monsoon, weakening, right, for India and, causing massive problems there, droughts, weird effects on plants or effects on solar panels not being able to get enough sun. So there's all sorts of, it's also pollution, right? Like, so there's pollution effects might damage the ozone layer. We can go on, and we'll never know what it'll do until we do it, right? This is not the sort of thing that can be predicted with models. We don't have good enough models for this. So yeah, so you can do that and make the world safer for markets, or you can try and plan our human part of the world, our interchange with nature. So that's why we aren't super excited about geoengineering, because it's not really a solution, right? You're going to continue to build up the carbon, right? And then other aspects of the environmental crisis are unaffected, right? Extinctions will go on, the ocean will acidify, right? Because that has to do with CO2. And there are other crises that might be caused by high accumulations of CO2. So yeah, it's not a great solution.
So my question is, how do you think that there's going to have to be some kind of major event like of death in the world, or global warming where the seas are rising and we're losing land mass along the coastlines to make some kind of clear unified effort in regards to some of the plans that you have? I mean, what's going to be the impetus to actually implement some of the plans that you're actually outlining?
Well, I mean, we're saying that it's not that shocks or crises lead to people changing their thinking, right? Mm-hmm. Instead, you have to change your thinking so then you can take advantage of crises. And you have to organize before that. You have to work out your ideas. I mean, the neoliberals spent 30 years developing networks of think tanks and writing books, and they have this very closely connected organization, and they had a solution for everything, and they would actually engage certain intellectuals to be public figures like Milton Friedman, and they would do all these things to shift opinions, right? And so they could be ready when there were crises. And again, I think we're living through a really bad crisis right now, right? I mean, this should be a wake-up call, but because we don't have the framing, we don't understand, why is there a pandemic? What can we do to prevent future pandemics? That's because we don't have that ideology, that worldview, nothing changes. So things will get worse. There'll be more bad crises for sure. There'll be more pandemics.
So winding down here, what do you both think about the near future and the distant future? Do you think we're going to end up dystopian, or we're going to have a lot of issues that we have to deal with that are presented in your book, or do you have some optimism?
Well, I think it's, at some level, like the worse, the better, because I think capitalism has never offered people so little, right? And as in, people don't think that their children will be better off than they have been, or people don't think that anymore. And that's a big shift, right? That is a new thing in the history of capitalism. And that should embolden critics of capitalism. And then the other thing is that people are clearly interested and want new ideas. And I think we're going to hopefully see a debate on what we need to do to prevent things. And I think we're also optimistic where these problems are soluble, right? As in, we can stop extinctions, we can create global equality, we can plan the economy. All these things are definitely within reach. And hopefully we start talking about that more. So I think there's reasons to be pessimistic, but also optimistic.
Anything to add there, Drew?
I mean, I was thinking of trying to add something, but Troy said it all. Like,
Yeah.
I am hopeful for the future, even as I'm very, there's a lot that we have to do, I guess.
Right. Well, you've done a really great job in the book in laying out the issues and some of the things that we may be able to attempt as a society worldwide. And thank you for writing the book, The Half-Earth Socialism. And we'll bring Jennifer back in here.
Hi, thank you so much. I have learned so much just from this conversation without having read the book, so I can't wait to read the book. For those of you watching, remember that you can always purchase a copy of Half-Earth Socialism through the registration website until 10 p.m. this evening, April 19th. You can also borrow the book from your local libraries. Hopefully they have them on the shelves right now, and if not, put down a hold and they will purchase the book for the collection. Thank you, Drew, Troy, Kevin. This has been eye-opening. And I hope that everybody keeps watching dinnerdisrupted.com and your local library website for more events like this one. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.